Hello everyone, Ruth Myers here. Thank you for attending the seminar. We've got a lot of different topics to cover, and they all fall under the general heading of trauma-informed support to people with IDD. Now, you may be wondering, well, what in the world does that mean? It's a whole bunch of different stuff together. And the movement towards understanding people in terms of trauma-informed care actually started 35 years ago in Scotland, of all places, where people understood that extreme toxic stress and or overt flagrant trauma, if unaddressed, has impacts on people from head to toe. And it's lifelong until people have a chance to heal and recover. What I'd like to talk with y'all today about is what are the different types of stress. Good stress, we hear there's good stress. Bad stress, toxic stress, where if you don't get any relief, it builds up and it has an effect on people. And trauma. And can the effects of toxic stress and trauma be healed? Of course they can. And in fact, the most important part of that healing is how a person gets to live their everyday life. So we're going to talk in a lot of detail about all different kinds of things. I admit to being a psychiatrist. I've been a shrinkette for a long, long time, and I've specialized in people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are thought to be really complicated since 1989. So that pretty much makes me an antique. And so I will be probably sharing some stories that are from a really long time ago. And I hope they are of interest to you. They continue to be of interest to me because it's what we do, right? We're interested in people's stories. So the first question to ask is what do, and I know most of you have taken PROACT, so you already know the answer to this question. Our employers, the people we work for, what do they owe direct support professionals and all of us that work directly with the person? What do those people owe us? I'll ask that question at the end of the day, but I'll bet you all already know the answer. Are the people we work for allowed to be rude, sexist, racist, foul-mouthed, disrespectful, inappropriately dressed, angry, naked in their own homes? Of course they are. Yet we have all, haven't we, worked with people that came to us from settings where they were ritually punished and reprimanded for these ordinary characteristics that are not especially pleasant, but they're not illegal either. This is kind of where we start with this whole idea of when people have been beat down, reprimanded for just trying to live their lives like anybody else. That's one of the versions of built up toxic stress that works on people. We'll talk about how in a minute. So, what is a trauma-informed response to Sandy masturbating in the living room? Well, we start with whose living room is it? Sandy's. So if the thing is privacy, if we're just sitting there watching, that ain't right, is it? So the trauma-informed response is to respect her or him or them who are masturbating in their own living room and walk away, give them privacy. Yet, how many of you have worked in places where they'll say, oh no, take that to your bedroom? Well, no, it's Sandy's living room, right? Home of one's own. Chris is hammering the furniture to pieces. Well, have you all worked in places where that's considered a big catastrophe? Yeah, I'm sure we've all worked in places like that. But in fact, is that even an emergency? No, it's just stuff. And I'd much rather Chris was beating objects to pieces than hurting themselves or someone else. So the trauma-informed response is to back away, make sure that nobody's getting hurt. Now the recovery response, where you're going to help Chris recover from whatever they're trying to process, well, that's where you offer to help. Yeah, you want me to crash that thing there, or you got that covered? Right? Different way of thinking, isn't it? How about Joe calls the police every day? What's the trauma-informed response? Find out what Joe's really afraid of. If we just try and artificially say, oh no, you're not allowed to do that, or if the police try and put limits on that, it doesn't go well, does it? Person really needs to know they have a way to get help. We can figure out something else, but just fighting with somebody. Kim is refusing to go to Walmart. Now, Kim and I are kind of in the same camp, because I'm like, Walmart lights are unbelievably painful and toxic to people with autism, people with Fragile X syndrome, people with migraines. So if Kim has said they're not going, we're not going, right? Why would we consider it a benefit to talk Kim into going to a place where they don't want to go? Different ways of responding, huh? Bean spits. Bean spits. This is several of our employers, they spit. Is that a felony? Probably not. And there's so many reasons people spit. When we talk about the medical section, for example, we'll talk about the fact that some people spit because they have extremely severe asthma or reflux or a tic disorder or some other very important health problem that if we just, say no, no, no to spitting, we're going to miss the whole point, aren't we? And Porter tries to punch people. Trauma-informed response is not a order or a reprimand, is it? The trauma-informed response is to give that person a way that they can punch without anybody else getting hurt. And that's the purpose behind extraordinary blocking, which everybody at STEP learns about as part of their PROACT training. So I might have mentioned, I'm kind of old. My specialty is a physician, like I mentioned, since '89. People with IDD who have aggression, self-injury, and or failure to thrive that's severe, long-term, and treatment resistant. However, a little bit more backstory is that my first job, which was a volunteer job, was when I was 13 at the local institution. It was a grim, old-style institution in Ohio where the paid staff had gone on strike because of the conditions. And so they got us, the junior ARC, to staff the facility. And I know that they appointed me because, at 13 I was so mature and so insightful and I had a pulse. That was the reason that they wanted me to do this job. I was one staff member for 50 young adults with IDD if everybody else showed up. It was more if they didn't. And I'll bet you've seen this too. What amazed me is that these 50 people were living in just the most grim circumstances you could ever imagine. Yet they hadn't given in or given up. The majority of those people still had decency in their character. Now, these people happen to be people that communicate without any speech, so people that were completely nonverbal. And in those days, this is, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, they were not given credit for any kind of thinking life. Yet, being there with those people round the clock, you can see people, see the communication, and see the resilience and strength of character. And I got to believe in that the people with IDD that were able to survive all the healthcare discrimination they survive as children, if they could survive that into becoming teenagers or young adults, there was something stronger about them than other people. And that hooked me and continues to hook me all these years later. In other seminars, we'll talk about healthcare access discrimination. We'll talk about misuse of advanced directives in hospice. We'll talk about some really life-threatening challenges people face in terms of healthcare discrimination and other forms of discrimination. Not the least of which is the effect on people from the standpoint of toxic stress. So that was at 13, because I was so wise and it's like I had a pulse, right? I've had a bunch of other DSP jobs, working in classrooms, working as overnight staff in group homes. I bet some of you are night shift people. Yep. And we know what all the secrets are, don't we? Just saying. Just saying. But I had another job, was not specifically with people with IDD, that was, I thought, going to be an easy job. And it was, I was going to be the intake worker at a level 1 trauma center psychiatric emergency room. Now, how hard could it be? I'm just going to be asking questions of people that they bring in who are in the middle of an acute psychotic episode. And like I said, land before time, so there's no metal detectors or, any of that kind of business. And I show up to my first day and I'm, 20. So I'm really exceptionally knowledgeable and well-trained. Oh my goodness. I got nothing, I just showed up. In those days, every self-respecting mental health care professional was also a chain smoker. So the guys in charge of the place greets me at the door where the no smoking sign has been broken off, right? And it's being renovated, so the place is pretty torn up. It looks kind of like a catastrophe. But anyways, so the guy, the chief psychiatrist, who turned out to be one of my most favorite teachers ever, said, you're the new person. Welcome. What do you smoke? I said, I don't smoke. Got this disappointed look like, And I said, but I do drink way too much coffee. And he said, okay, you can work here, come on in. And I'm gonna see my first person. Like I said, these are the people that, came up off the street, usually brought in by police, usually not doing well. So the first guy I'm gonna see is a giant, 6'6", at least 2 or 3 times my weight. As you can see, I'm not a fiercely well-built, offensive lineman or anything like that. And so great big guy. Police searched everybody before they came in, right? And he's this leisure-suited, yes, powder blue leisure suit, dating myself, with a bunch of bandanas wrapped around his head, which if I'd known anything, I would have known was a clue that he was probably having a lot of hallucinations. So I get in, gonna sit down, have my first intake. Got my clipboard, got my pen, got my list of questions. And the first question on the list, of course, is describe the symptoms that brought you to medical attention, or something to that effect, right? We sit down in this teeny little interview room. It was so small that our knees touched. And like I said, place was under construction, so the phone was missing. The alarm button had been disabled. The doorknob to open the door and leave was absent, so I could not open the door from the inside. And the little window had been taped over because they were getting ready to paint. So I kind of knew within a nanosecond that I was alone with no way to get out or call for help with a giant who'd just been brought in by the police. So, as you might guess, this revised my thinking a little in terms of, all right, explain to me this bad behavior. That's not what I'm going to start with, is it? So instead I said, right, when you know you cannot, not just should not, but cannot overpower somebody, and you don't want to anyway. I mean, it doesn't help people. You don't start by barking at people, right? So I start with, so, nice to meet you, sir. I hope that being searched by the police thing wasn't too much of a bother. And he said, well, hell no, it's no problem at all, because they didn't find my gun anyway. And he reached into his sock and pulled out a loaded gun and pointed it at me. Now, several things went through my mind. And I'm pretty sure that trying to bark at him then was an even worse idea than it already was. Like, that's not allowed here. Or, put that away. Or, how dare you? I mean, how stupid would that be, right? Yes, try and calm a person down by irritating them. So, I imagine you can all think of different things you might have said in that situation. I'm not saying what I said was the right thing, but I am here. I said, well, you know, that's a fine-looking gun. Can I see it? And he said, well, sure. And he handed it over to me, and I put it down next to me. Like an idiot, what I should have done, popped out the bullets, banged on the door till somebody came in. Didn't do that. It's my first day, and I had my clipboard. So I sat there with the loaded gun sitting next to me and asked all the rest of the questions. And finally, about an hour later, we're laughing it up. We're having a good old time. Somebody said, hey, didn't we have a new interviewer here? And they banged on the door, and that was that. But that encounter really helped me think a lot, and I continue to think about this idea of when we know how incredibly life-threatening it is to be abrasive or coercive or put restraints on people, we have to start thinking in terms of more towards, no, we can't do this, not just we shouldn't do this. And how does our thinking change when we know we absolutely can't and we absolutely must keep people safe? And then there was one other professional experience that really, really got me on this track in a lot of different ways, was because of being in an unusual specialty. I've been asked to do a lot of different stuff in a lot of different states. And in fact, oddly enough, you know, when I was young, I wished for a job with a little travel. Well, it turns out that I've done consultation, training, and evaluations and direct service in 50 states and 6 other countries. And it's interesting to me that everybody struggles with the same things. Medical discrimination, even in places where medicine is socialized, and this question about coercion, should we, shouldn't we? And because of being an unusual specialty, I've been invited a number of places to work with teams who thought that they were doing things the right way, put somebody in a restraint, and killed them. A horrible, horrible tragedy in so many ways. And it takes companies years and years to come back from that, if they ever come back from that. And as I tried to work to support those people, I kept thinking, let's not, if we possibly can, because coercion doesn't just harm the people we serve, does it? Coercion has terrible effects on the people that are practicing it. And those effects are measurable. So we think, what kind of direct support professionals are the most successful with people who have aggression, self-injury, and or failure to thrive that is severe, long-term, and treatment resistant? And we can all think of those people in an instant. And one of the first things that people always remember is that, yeah, and he doesn't yell at them, and he doesn't threaten them, and he's not punitive, or she's just got this way where people feel safe, and she's just like a walking Valium, and you hear those descriptions of people, that's part of what we're talking about in terms of trauma-informed support. It's the people, rather than adding more anger and hostility energy in a situation, they manage to bring some calm to the situation as much as possible. So we're talking about people. I tend to focus on people that other people think are impossible to support, people that people think that really can't recover or can't do well. And it turns out there's a lot of literature on people who are not supposed to be able to recover and do. And very wisely, a number of really smart people have taken the time to study people who had a terrible prognosis for whatever reason, but recovered, succeeded, did well. So people that have had have terrible prognosis cancers, people with terrible prognosis lung diseases, people with schizophrenia, the more severe forms, people with the more severe forms of autism, and just about every difficult chronic health condition you can name. People with some of the more severe forms of, let's say, rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. People that have had catastrophic head injuries or severe strokes that have gone on to recover and do well. What was it? Well, some people say, well, maybe they didn't have it as bad as the people who didn't do well. Well, that's not true. Those people had the same findings as people who didn't do well. So the people who did well, was there anything different about their care? We want to find out, right? Well, it turns out that according to them, and this is across all these poor prognosis conditions, which is interesting to me, the things that those people believe help them recover don't really have much to do with the medical care they're getting, except that the medical care is highly individualized. So throwing the practice protocol book at somebody, even though it's very seductive, because it makes you think you're doing something really scientific, it's in fact not the way to go. The most important thing every one of those people across all those different studies note is that someone who believes in me, people who love me or care about me and are optimistic. How about that, huh? They cite that as the most important factor. A nice, safe place to live. And part of the reason I love working for STEP is that STEP does this better than any organization I've ever seen in 50 states and 6 other countries, is people having a home of their own that's really for them. Something interesting to do with my day. All those people who shouldn't have recovered and did put those, and then the fourth thing is emphasis on my strengths. So if somebody, for example, is fabulous at creating art, or fabulous at playing the piano, or fabulous at crushing all their recycling bottles into powder, that's what they get to do with whatever energy they got. And they did better. And this flies in the face of certain recommendations. Some of the, for example, some of the older style, what I would say less sophisticated behavior analysis approaches really focus on the idea that you should do ABA style program with people as many hours a day as they're awake. When in fact, that's not what successful people with autism say is what helps them. It's kind of the opposite. And that's why emphasis on strengths, spending as little time as possible on things that maybe I do need to work on, even though I don't think so, and letting me decide what else to do with my energy. Respect for my opinion. Even if we can't follow your opinion, we need to know what it is. We need to incorporate that. And for example, if I'm talking with somebody and I really think this medicine will help them, and they really think this medicine will help them, which thing are we going to try first, right? Their idea. Otherwise, nothing else will be a possibility. And oftentimes the person's right. Sometimes it doesn't work out the way they think. But that's where we should start. And the person always knows that they are the pilot. Now, can you do all this with people who are nonverbal? Of course. And it just means we need to know nonverbal ways to communicate with people that communicate without using speech. And we have another seminar on that as well. That's part of the STEP training program. Individualized treatment, friends and supportive family, separation from abusive family, and trauma-informed. What does that mean exactly? Well, what you'll read in the SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Health Administration, SAMHSA, Health Services Administration, you know what I mean, is the overall adjustment in the way we think about people is when a person has some kind of difficult symptom, beating people up, breaking up the furniture, instead of saying, what bad thing did you do? Which gets us nowhere. The question in a trauma-informed support approach is, what happened to you that drives you to do this? And then it emphasizes comfort versus control. Because if you can make that person's violent self-expression safe for them and other people, that person will get a chance to work through something. It speculates that just about everybody in services or not in services has been exposed to excessive toxic stress or overt trauma. Replaces coercion with healing and recovery, and no one gets hurt. Most, if not all, of the protocols for creating trauma-informed environments emphasize preparation. And we do a lot of that at STEP, right? The retrofitted homes, the safe appliances, all the things where if a person needs to bust stuff up or throw things, nobody's going to get hurt while it's happening. But there's a lot of unpredictable neurology going on, isn't there? There's certain seizures, there's flashbacks, there's panic attacks. Preparation eventually fails. And that's the other part of what do we do in the middle of what some people call a behavior. I don't particularly like that terminology because it doesn't express the fact that what it is a clue or an opportunity to understand what's really going on with this person inside and out. And like pretty much everybody, I've had my share of getting popped and thrown around and bitten and blah, blah, blah. And opportunity is not always the first word that springs to mind, is it? But it is, in fact, what we have. So preparation eventually fails. We do everything we can to prepare the environment, but we miss something, or something breaks. We're kind to people. Kindness does kind of matter, doesn't it? The environment, the person's home, where they work, where they go, is exactly what that person says they want, right down to the paint color shades and the texture of their bedspread and everything else. The schedule is exactly what the person says they want. They're in the middle of doing something they really enjoy, and they suddenly explode. That's that unpredictable neurology, neuropsychiatry, that a lot of trauma, a lot of injury, and a lot of illness that happens to people will drive those explosive times, no matter how well everything is prepared for them. We also know, right, we know that just putting hands on the person and controlling their body is going to cause way more harm than good. So what do we do instead? The task at those times when preparation fails, it goes from force the person to stop to instead make it safe. So at the very, one of the most simple ways to describe this is if the person is starting to punch, give them something to punch. Blocking pads, whatever, until they've punched it out. If they're going after staff, then pad staff. We had one fella, it took us 3 months to get somebody to operate on his terribly abscessed teeth. And his way of expressing his displeasure with those horribly abscessed teeth was to bite arms, his own and everyone else's. So people had the incredibly acrobatic task of patting their own arms and directing him, when he was going to bite himself, to bite their padding instead. It sounds really awkward and it's kind of funny looking, but it worked. It worked. He was able to sleep. He wasn't so angry. He was as frustrated as everybody else with having to wait, but he didn't destroy himself or anybody else in the process. And the second half of that is to then learn why. Why did this happen? And that's why we created Extraordinary Blocking, which is one of the step-specific modules after PROACT. So what's hard about this? It all kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Well, I think, observing people over the years, I think that it's very hard to stay in the compassionate headspace when a person, you're pretty sure they could control this aggression. You're pretty sure they could control this destructiveness, and they choose not to. People also, I think, have a hard time staying compassionate if the person lies to them, cheats, steals stuff from them, bashes their car, stuff that really gets under people's skin. And it's hard for people that are right in the middle of it to back up and say, well, this person knows that I am their direct support professional, and the two of us getting along is going to result in them having a lot more fun, yet they're sabotaging that. Why would they do that? Trauma-informed understanding. Even though the surface activity looks like it's under the person's control, whatever's driving it is still not quite. People don't always want to cooperate and tell the truth. And for people to do that all the time, they really got to trust the people that they are working with. Well, is there any good reason for people with IDD to trust us? Maybe us individually, personally, but the system has made some pretty big mistakes, hasn't it? Now, these are people that are currently receiving services in our organization. For example, the first man, before he came to STEP, he was found wandering the streets after watching his brother suicide by gunshot wound to the head. When he was referred to us, he was described as a disobedient runner. In fact, his brother had been begging for services for 3 years, had locked him, this man, in a house and starved him because he thought he should lose weight, and he lost 250 pounds from starvation over a very short period of time. And then finally gave up. There were many reports to different social services agencies. The police were called several times. That's where I got the information, because the regional center had removed all of this factual information from his record. And the various agencies would say, oh, just wait. Oh, just wait. We'll get to it. Another person that's in services here had the experience of a foster father who was videotaped in the act of raping her. She was then transferred to a group home where 5 people draped themselves over her body to restrain her, to force her to undergo catheterization and J-tube changes. Subsequent to that, and she's just a little bit of a thing, she still got violent enough to get out of that place, and she landed in a very prominent university-based hospital and was kept in a cage there for a little over 9 months until she came to STEP. The employer was starved for the first several years of her life in an overseas orphanage. She was raped by an adoptive family member. She was used as a prostitute at a children's residential facility. Got some trust issues. She's doing beautifully. How would you feel knowing this about a person? How would you feel about putting hands on them, tying them down, forcing anything on them? Just doesn't feel right at all, does it? A psychiatry facility manipulated the system so a very mentally ill employer ended up in prison and now has a record for doing stuff that was clearly symptoms of her serious mental illness. What kind of hostility is that? That person, of course, has a very hard time with trust. These are all recent situations. These are people that we all work with every day. And the stories just go on. And I imagine some of you came from places where some pretty grim things were done to people. And you know that the effect of that just doesn't go away, does it? And every bit of it makes it impossible for people to really totally trust those of us that are supposed to provide services. We have to be ready to be tested. So people say, well, okay, these horrible things happen, or a person's just had an incredibly hard life. So what? Does that affect a person? And the answer is, oh my goodness, yes. Very, very yes. And this has been very, very well studied, and I think we've all observed it. What happens if a person has constant, unremitting stress or unresolved trauma? How does it affect a person? Well, these are well-documented effects, and should not surprise any of us that all of these things, just about, occur more often in people with IDD. There's no reason, for example, that people with schizophrenia should have a lifespan that's 20 years shorter than that of the general population, just based on pure medical facts. Similarly, there was a recent study that said that the average lifespan for people with autism is 36 years of age. That seems very, very low to me, but that came from a BCBA PhD who has autism, who studied this, and said that all of those studies put together seem to show that horrifically shortened lifespan for no other physiologic reason than unremitting stress and unresolved trauma. Premature death, increased rate of lung diseases, #1 cause of death among people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are lung problems. We have suicide, eating disorders, addictions, liver disease. Hard to see how that connects up, but when we understand inflammation, it kind of does, doesn't it? Much higher rates of other inflammatory conditions, cardiovascular disease is accelerated. People functioning below their capabilities because so much of their brain is tied up in self-defense. And markedly higher rates of cancer and markedly harder time getting the treatments that usually work for cancer to work properly. And the only consistent factor that makes any sense physiologically is unremitting toxic stress or unresolved trauma. I put so-called personality disorders because so many times people have ways of coping that irritate people. And so people want to kind of indict their personality. But in fact, it usually turns out that it's more on this list of unremitting toxic stress, unresolved trauma. So, does unremitting toxic stress or unresolved trauma have an effect in the workplace on people who provide support to individuals? And the answer is yes, highly measurable. If there's failure to address unresolved trauma or unremitting toxic stress, the other measurable and objective problem is that there's much higher, faster turnover. There's a marked spike in workers' compensation. Staff get hurt a lot more. People call out more. There's a lot more injuries to everybody. There are preventable deaths. Work performance below capabilities, and higher rates of burnout and hostility among staff. And the very first, there's a really good, actually it's a monograph with a compilation of evidence-based studies. One of the first evidence-based studies of a very old-style, very grim institution that made a complete revision from a coercion-based model, old-style institution model, to a trauma-informed model, eliminated the use of seclusion and restraint and manual restraint, eliminated most of the sedating medicine people were on, eliminated even the option to punish people, stick them in seclusion, anything like that, for a group of people that were considered to be the worst of the worst in terms of violence to self and others in a statewide system. And by the way, this was a state system that was 48th in funding to services for people with IDD and 49th in funding to services for people with serious mental illness. So this was not a wealthy state that did this, and they did this in the 80s. And the evidence was gathered and had exactly the same effects we'd hoped for. Workers' compensation costs went from the highest to the lowest in the state. The individuals themselves basically improved so much, nobody could believe they even had these big reputations. Injuries declined, preventable deaths declined, suicides stopped, all the things you hope to see. The reason why I like to mention this study is I'm intimately aware of it because I wrote it, and it's part of this monograph, Moving from Coercion to Collaboration in Mental Health Services. It was an invited publication, and I would like to say that it just had that fabulous writing that I did, but that wasn't it. The reason I mention this is because it's old. You know, these data were disseminated in 2001, published in 2004. And so, of course, we were kind of swaggering around thinking we kind of invented it, didn't we? But any guesses as to the first truly scientifically done evidence-based study in a facility that served the people that were the most complicated neuropsychiatrically, people that were poor, had no real support or resources, no medicines, and had been kept, in a lot of leather and metal chains and restraints most every waking hour of every day. What happened when those chains and all the restraints and all the intoxicants, they didn't have medicines, but they did get the people drunk every day to try and control them? Any guesses as to the year that this study was published, which shows the data and all the same results. Injuries plummeted, suicide stopped, people got well better, more than anybody thought. Staff injuries declined, all of it. Want to guess the year, anybody? 1835. And many studies since. So we hoped we invented it, but we didn't. And the book is Total Abolition of the Use of Personal Restraint in the Treatment of the Insane, written by Dr. Robert Gardiner Hill at the Lincoln Lunatic Asylum in England. It's a great book. I have a couple of first editions. It's amazing. So, toxic stress and trauma, we'll talk about that, what the differences are. But just to review, and I think everybody probably already knows this, but the trauma percentages for people with developmental disabilities are grim, aren't they? They range from 87 to 100%, depending on sample. Dr. Nora Baladarian did a study of people that had not come to clinical attention, so people that didn't have activities of concern or quote-unquote behaviors, and she discovered the abuse and trauma percentage was 66%. So even people that aren't complaining very much often carry a severe trauma burden. The abuses, and most of the trauma is abuse, not all, but most, are usually by a person in a position of trust, a parent, a staff member, a caregiver of some other variety. The stranger attack is not as common in this population as opposed to the general population. We also found in our studies that any history of severe neglect, where a person was, starved or not given medicine for a long time, or lived in squalor, or what have you, as we got to know the person, we always discovered abuse as well. And a evidence-based protocol was published almost 30 years ago on treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder in people with IDD. And like I wrote it, not saying it's fabulous writing or anything, but I will note that this is an evidence-based protocol that applies to people whether or not they use speech to communicate. So if anybody tells you there's no research that supports treatment, that's simply incorrect. I mentioned this article that I wrote because it's old, but there's lots of other people that have written lots of other stuff that's way cooler to read. And I'll give you a list of some of those authors in a minute. The other thing that we published, this is an article, my last name used to be Ryan in case that wasn't obvious. Physician unwitting participation in abuse and neglect of persons with developmental disabilities. Well, that one just rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it? We were inspired to write this article because a buddy of ours, a really good doctor, thought he was ordering a specialized bed, when in fact the foster care provider was using that medical order as justification to keep a 13-year-old in a 6-sided wooden box for 5 years. And we saw instance after instance where a physician didn't realize that what they were ordering was in fact being twisted into a tool of abuse. And we had some recommendations to come out of this. The other thing is that there are some procedures that were thought to be medical procedures that just aren't. But people would try and frame them as such. And as my good friend Michelle Martin said, she's a psychiatrist I knew many years ago, tell it to the neurotransmitters. When something hurts a person, the body knows, no matter what we call it. So what do the studies say is the biggest obstacle to addressing trauma? I know you know the answer to this. Asking the questions. And there's a lot of reasons people fail to ask the questions. And then realizing that it matters. We've got a gal who, her mother tried to murder her by burning her and her siblings to death in a house fire. She has scars on her body from this. This happened when she was just a baby. I know you're not going to believe this, but she has proclaimed that she wants nothing to do with a gas stove, with campfires, with anything like that. And you know there's going to be somebody over here saying, well, that happened such a long time ago. Why should that bother her? Because it does. Realizing it matters. And these two consistent obstacles are present with other populations as well. People with autism who do not have an intellectual disability, people with serious mental illness. Most of the time, the obstacle to their recovery is not their illness or autism or blah, blah, blah. It's the trauma issues. So I promised you some better authors than myself. Here is a short list. These are some of my most favorite people. And if you can ever read stuff that they've written on this whole topic, it will enrich you so much. So people will ask, what's the difference between good stress, bad stress, and trauma? Well, it's now kind of measurable, which is very cool, because you can kind of describe it, but we can actually see it lighting up people's brains. One, I put this in because it's interesting to me. It talks about the effect on people in response to certain coaching styles. And we've all heard of what was the movie? I think it was called Ricochet or something like that, where a music teacher was just incredibly abusive, but the musician he was teaching did well anyway. Interesting to me, the negative coaching for compliance style activities basically stress people out, shut down most of their brain, so they can just focus on that one thing. Whereas a positive, encouraging, compassionate style lights up a person's whole brain with passion and interest. Which brain do you think produces a better outcome? The one where most of it's shut down in fear? Of course. When people are able to feel and think with all of their powers at the same time, the outcome is better. And that is very specifically changed by how we work with a person. The domineering coach for compliance, you do this thing, ends up with this brain that's barely functioning. Now, when people are already having a hard time with intellectual function, why would we want to shut it down any further? Right? So let's look at some more very colorful brains. These are cross sections of brains, one in a person with active untreated PTSD and another person who's healthy. And the main thing is that this person is halfway on fire most of the time. Every part of their brain is activated to the point of overwhelm, to the point where most of it just doesn't function coherently. It just takes a tiniest little bit of electricity and the person will be in flashbacks or panic attacks or fight, flight, freeze, because their brain is mostly there most of the time. However, if the person's brain is healthy and peaceful, it's all available. They can access their brain. It's not taken up with stress and anxiety. They can access any part of their brain much more efficiently. This is just another picture of the same kind of phenomenon. I wanted to mention this very colorful brain that talks about the anatomy of anxiety. And I think it's kind of a cool thing to notice this little red doodad, that's the medical technical term, doodad, in the middle called the amygdala. What lives there? Anger, panic, recklessness, and rage. And that part of the brain is the only consistently unusual brain structure in people with autism. And that's part of and it's also very specifically altered by trauma. So whereas one reason is congenital, people with autism are born with this tendency, people with trauma can develop this. And that's part of the reason why people used to mix up autism and PTSD so much. There's a lot of other really major differences, obviously, between autism without trauma and severe PTSD, but one of the areas of overlap is the amygdala. You'll notice this is all the middle of the brain stuff, the amygdala, the limbic system. What does it matter? Unstressed, you have all these nice green arrows in your brain. Well, maybe not exactly like that. You can think straight. You can access parts of your brain at will. In a stressed brain, all the control comes from deep inside. Rage, moods, not very good at memory or too much memory. Memory takes over and it's a flashback. So, again, another colorful cross-section of the brain showing those middle of the brain structures and some of the different functions that go with the inner versus other structures. And again, this is a different imaging of a person trying to concentrate on a task. In a healthy brain, they can light up all different parts of their brain to access, to complete a task. With a person who has chronic stress, there's not much lit up, even though they're trying to do the same task. And it's all related to unresolved trauma, clogging up all of that coherence between different parts of the brain. And this is another view of that. So we have the outside, very colorful brain, conveniently labeled the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe. These are the outer structures of the brain, thought to be more recent in terms of how humans developed. And then we've got the middle part of the brain. I also want to mention that this is the front, but this is where vision is all understood. That's important. What you see has to process through a lot of stuff before you know what it is you're seeing and what you think about it. So, what's good stress? Right? Almost sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? But what is good stress? This lights up the outer part of the brain and the inner part of the brain in balance. Like those pictures you saw of people concentrating on a task and they can access their whole brain while they're doing it. It's just the right amount of epinephrine, norepinephrine, people call those adrenalines. People will describe improved short-term memory. I remember every detail, like it just happened. They can focus on a detail and see the whole picture of what's going on. They talk about things like being in the zone, right? Have you heard that kind of expression, being in the zone? They can problem solve in the moment, thinking of the future. And sometimes people will even report that their ability to collate detail is so good, it feels like things slow down. People are able to have emotions that are in proportion to the situation. And their sociability and their ability to understand others remains intact. Now, what are examples? Good stress is the stuff we choose. This is stress we can control and start and stop. So, competitive sports that we choose. Does this apply if somebody else forces a person into competitive sports? No. If a person is encouraged and forced into sports and they never like it, they never get a good stress pattern in their brain. It's always the toxic stress. Some people will be pushed into something and like it, and their brain's response to it changes. But the trope of the person who's forced to play hockey, who doesn't want to, never did, never does, because it might look good on their resume, it's not a good thing for people at all. Challenging course of study, performance in plays, performance of music, big events, big family events like a wedding or a reunion, things of that nature. Those are examples of good stresses. They light up people's brains, they create good memory, they're an opportunity for learning, and so on. So what are toxic stresses? What happens? Well, they're temporary. They shut down most of the outside brain stuff. The excessive or bad stresses drown the brain in adrenaline, norepinephrine, to the point where this prefrontal part, the outer parts, they're pretty much shut off. And all that inner stuff, the amygdala, the limbic region, hippocampus, one way or the other, those are all lit up way out of proportion. And people will feel like they're going blank almost. They can't think straight. They can't really focus. They're very distractible. And people will talk about sensations of being, vapor locked or overwhelmed or melting down or something of that nature. And they have disorganized impulsive behavior, which is another good way to describe a meltdown. The term meltdown works just fine. In response to basically what's right in front of them. They can't really think beyond right here, if they can think at all. Well, over time, the big thing that distinguishes toxic stress from trauma is that the effects of toxic stress can be relieved by certain types of brain rest without any special kind of treatment or recovery. But if a person lives with unrelenting toxic stress, it starts to produce injury in a person's brain. It starts to produce scarring, very similar to what happens with trauma. Now, over time, if people are subjected then to this unrelenting toxic stress, how do they change? Well, you saw how the brain changes. Not surprising that people get to be very narrowed and rigid in their thinking. They start to get kind of tunnel visioned. There's 10 things that need to be done, but they can't get done with number 2 and they can't think about anything else. Their pleasant habits, virtuous vices, things people do to have fun, start to be extreme. People that like the occasional slice of cake are suddenly wanting to eat 2 cakes every single night. Or the occasional sip of brown liquor turns into a quart of tequila. People start to pull away from people they care about, and they begin to think that there's nothing they can do about their situation. They think they're really stuck. What are examples? And as I talk about these, think about the people we serve. Think about if any of this might be pertinent to some of the people you support. How about people in a rotten or boring job that they don't like and can't get away from? This used to be the sheltered workshop story, right? Well, we got a spot in the sheltered workshop for you, for a person who doesn't like that kind of work and can't get away from it because there's no other option. Living with somebody the person dislikes. This is one of the most important parts of home of one's own, is who, if anybody, a person lives with. There's one fella that we worked with where we were being asked to medicate him. Our little team was. We were being asked to put him on a bunch of sedating medicine. Okay, stay with me here. It's a guy with autism, loves his electronics, is forced to share a bedroom with somebody he's scared of who destroys his electronics. I don't think we got a pill for that, right? Finally, organized medicine has realized that constant exposure to bigotry, racism, dysphobia, which is prejudice against people with disabilities, actually damages people like any other toxic stress. Institutional racism is one of the other names that you'll hear, and all of it is poisonous to people's health. Delayed health care actually is a type of toxic stress. So even those, what I call casual everyday cruelties of, oh, we just got to do a prior authorization, or the pharmacy won't have it for 3 or 4 days, all of those delays hurt people. And they're unnecessary, aren't they? COVID-19 pandemic precautions, when they're done in a snotty and hostile way. Now, they can be done in a fun and lighthearted way, as was done for much of the pandemic here at STEP. But we did see some people that kind of weaponized COVID-19 to make it a way more traumatic than it needed to be. Obviously, abrasive, demeaning, or incompetent support staff are just tremendous scarring in a person's brain as a result of that. And interestingly, a lot of studies talk very specifically about crappy food. People not being allowed to choose what they eat and not being allowed to choose how it's prepared. And I don't know why food per se, but yeah, that is one of the recurrent themes in some of these examples of unrelenting toxic stress. So what are other kind of embedded examples of toxic stresses? Lack of choice. Even about everyday things. Oh no, don't wear those. Wear this. No, I want to wear 2 different color socks and I want to carry a baby doll. Having to fight to do stuff like that hurts people. What I call gratuitous criticism, and have we all worked alongside people that do this? They're constantly offering guidance and advice. Oh, you don't want to wear that way. Do you really want to button both those buttons? I'm not sure those socks exactly go. Do you, only 1 cookie for you, not 2 cookies, and on and on and on. And that's not the right way to crack an egg, and blah, blah, blah. That's not the right way to stack your clean dishes. Constant barrage of what some people think is guidance. It's gratuitous criticism. We should think each time we want to offer somebody some advice that the way their brain is configured, every piece of advice or correction will be experienced by that person as a punch in the face. Do we really, really need to do that? But, if somebody's trying to change habits, how many habits can a person be expected to change at the same time? 12? What do we see on most of the support plans, particularly, for school-age people? They have a individual education plan or an individual support plan that lists 10 objectives. Is that neurologically reasonable or even possible? Most of the studies show that if people want to modify a personal habit, the most they can modify when they're highly motivated and highly supported is 2 or 3. So those, 10 objective support plans, what's that? It's not trauma-informed support. It's not neurologically sensible. And of course, blaming people for stuff they can't control, obviously, very toxic. So people have been stressed a long, long time, to the point where it's causing injury. What do we do about it? Well, For a long time, a buddy of mine did these burnout workshops, recognition, prevention, treatment of burnout among everybody, not just people providing services, but people receiving services who most certainly do burn out on the system, just like the people providing services do. Well, what do we do about it? Well, of course, my buddy and I were both healthcare professionals, so we'd get into these workshops and we would say, what is it that you do to relieve the effects of stress? And since we're medical, they were like, well, I get 30 minutes of exercise 5 days a week. I eat a mostly plant-based diet, and I meditate every day. I'm like, what a load of nonsense. I mean, some of us really do that. Like, I'm a vegan, I meditate, but I pretty much think exercise is the Antichrist. So I will exercise because it's good for me, but I do not make the mistake of thinking that relieves my stress in any way. So what are some of the things when people realize they could say what they really meant? These are the things people talk about. Obviously, not all apply to every person. The right amount of vice, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, what have you, weed. There's no safe amount of tobacco, but you know what I mean, right? Some people, it's either smoke a cigarette or burn down a building, right? So I don't endorse cigarette smoking in any form, but I also respect it for certain people, right? Entertainment that the person chooses. There's one guy, he's in the enhanced program. He loves movies where stuff blows up. Well, every now and then he'll get a brand new staff who says, well, that's not teaching him anything very useful. And you can just watch it happen. You can almost set your watch by somebody deciding that he's going to watch shows that educate him better. And within 2 to 3 weeks, the windows are going to be blown out of his house. Because for him, watching stuff blow up is the best thing. It's the thing that relieves his stress. Spiritual practices the person chooses. Not, well, we got this one church that gives everybody like cookies and punch, so we just load everybody in the van and go there. Individualized self-expression, and not just little things like being able to create art and stuff like that, but things like people who are expressing gender identity different than what they were assigned at birth, for example. And everybody not just saying, oh, that's all right with me, it's everybody leaning in, saying, oh yeah, girl, we got you. Time alone with no one telling me what to do, right? Daytime sex with a partner. Boy, it was really wonderful. And this is like 10 years of burnout workshops. Every single one, when finally somebody says sex, the whole room would erupt. Oh yeah, happy marriage, children. What do you notice about this list in regards to people with IDD? In many situations, these things are not available to people on demand. And in even worse situations, people are required to earn access to the things they like to do by demonstrating certain appropriate behaviors. Now, if we truly understand the life-threatening nature of excessive, unremitting toxic stress, we understand that making that person earn their favorite movie or video game is like telling a person with severe diabetes they need to earn their insulin with their behavior. What are some of the things people develop as a way to manage stress? Not all of them are healthy. Now, I know everybody here only does healthy things. Well, I try out new vegan recipes. I drink freshly squeezed fruit juices from fruit that I picked from a tree. Right. Come on. These are examples of different stress relievers that people develop, people with IDD, that if people would just respect them, they'd be fine. There's one gal, she had to watch one segment of The Wizard of Oz for an hour a day, every day, and she did that for 15 years. People just let her alone, she was fine. It was her brain massage. I'm not saying I understood it, but I did respect it. There's a gal we work with, the only specific recipe that every staff member has to learn is how she likes her fried potatoes with cheese. She has an early childhood history of starvation, so there's something about that. And it's a requirement in a written contract with her staff that she gets those on demand. The first one, cup of coffee and a cigarette. Now this is a particularly sad story. This was a fellow who had had a long history of dreadful institutionalization. And this is a story from California. He had, like I said, a dreadful history of abuses and torture in an institution. And he found that if he was getting overwhelmed, upset, explosive, what have you, all he had to do was have a cup of coffee and a cigarette. He was fine. So everybody's like, maybe we ought to respect that. Well, I bet you can already predict what happened. Staff member, enthusiastic young man, physical fitness nut. He signed the paper that said, I will provide a cup of coffee and a cigarette anytime this man asks. And then when he got to working with him one-on-one, the guy said, started to get that look. Cup of coffee, cigarette, cup of coffee and a cigarette. The staff member said, oh, no, you don't really need that. We can do better for you. The guy had a horrific, epic flashback, very violent. The staff member restrained him and killed him. And the staff member went to prison. Why would we do that? Why would we think that we know somebody better than they know themselves, particularly when there's proof of concept? There's one fella that I worked with for many, many years. Nice man, nice family. And we were all sitting around, after doing some sort of official team meeting stuff, and his dad was pouring wine. And he kept looking and looking. He's a nonverbal guy with autism. And I thought, well, why not? His dad poured me a glass of wine and I gave it to him. And it was discovered in that moment that having about this much of a glass of wine caused him to feel like he was part of a family again. Why that? So what's the difference between toxic stress and trauma? Well, the big difference is that with toxic stress, if you catch it early enough, non-specific remedies can relieve the effect on a person's brain. And that's why the good Lord created vacations, right? But they got to be the real thing. But anyways, and by the way, do people with IDD need vacations? Oh, heck yeah, right? Right? Trauma. Now, the difference between toxic stress and trauma is that trauma is a type of event where one experience of it is enough to injure and scar a person's brain. It changes your brain. And it requires much more deliberate recovery and treatment protocols to relieve those effects. The most common traumas, as we talked about earlier, are abuses by people in positions of care. Positions of care and positions of trust. Natural disasters or forest fires, things of that nature, they're very, very hard. They're worse if the people that are supposed to help don't. For example, from the middle 1980s, a man I worked with, he had cerebral palsy, and he was in a program, a day program that was torched. And he himself, even though he could hardly walk, personally rescued 6 people from that fire and brought them out. And part of the reason he had to do that is that some of the firefighters stood outside and said, it's just a bunch of I won't say the whole word, it's just a bunch of retarded people, isn't it? And wanted to let it burn. And as you might imagine, the fire was horrific enough and several people did die. But that realizing that we can't count on these people, that part was even worse. And does it matter if a person has a very, very low IQ? Do they still feel that more acutely than anybody, right? These are some of the other types of trauma. Witnessing these horrible actions is also traumatic for people, particularly when the person being attacked or harmed is somebody they care about. Family member, colleague, coworker, housemate, what have you. Abuse by healthcare providers is highly traumatic for all the reasons that the firefighters standing outside the big fire was traumatic. So, reviewing the principles of trauma-informed care, almost everybody we know has experienced either toxic stress, particularly prejudice, or trauma. Toxic stress and trauma affect people with IDD the same way they affect everybody else, of course. If we offer this support properly, no one gets hurt. No one gets hurt. Sadly, when I've been asked to teach about this in some settings, the first thing they think is, well, do we just got to let people beat on us? No, that doesn't help anybody. A culture of trauma-informed care produces measurable benefits for the individuals and the people providing services. There's an idea that circles back from time to time. That's a tremendous error, which is the idea that direct support professionals ought to be neutral, detached, not warm, not affectionate, don't care, don't be involved. And people say, well, that's being professional, but it isn't. Being professional means we're being paid to do the right thing. Now, this idea of what some people call affectionless control, where I tell you what to do and I help change your clothes, but I'm not nice, I'm not involved with you, that has also been researched. And one of the grimmest examples was from the Renee Spitz videos from the 1940s and 50s, right? The babies that were given what was called custodial care, affectionless control, versus the babies that received affection, along with changing food. And those of you that are students of these things, you know what happened is that the babies that received what was called affectionless control, custodial care, no loving, no warmth, no affection, they couldn't be followed long term because they died. This is a very, very toxic thing to do to people that require direct care from others to survive. A distant controlling approach magnifies the effects of toxic stress and trauma. Other principles of trauma-informed care: nothing about me without me, knowing that person's opinion, respecting that person's opinion. Ask questions, stop giving orders. It's a different way to interact with people, but it helps people keep talking and communicating rather than picking a fight with them. No one gets hired unless the individual agrees to them, interviews them and agrees to them. People can fire their staff and don't have to give a reason. It's helpful if they're willing to, but they don't have to. Encourage the individual to create their own environment. We've got one gal, and we have to keep reminding her staff that the one thing she hates the most is when there's 2 staff there and they talk to each other without including her. Well, that shouldn't be that hard, right? But people, they think, well, we've got to train each other and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay. But we can adjust. We can do this better in a way that helps her. Trauma-informed care is more effective. People function better, they have fewer symptoms, they have fewer trips to the hospital, they require little or no psychotropic medicine. It's a hard shift still for people that come from highly coercive settings because they've been conditioned to believe that high coercion settings are somehow safer, even though the evidence is completely the opposite. Some people can't change, and they just got to move on. And we can't teach a duck to bark. We can, but nobody's happy with the outcome, right? Ruth, is it possible to know somebody for years and years and not know they had a trauma history? The answer is yes. One gal recently, she'd had a GYN evaluation, and they took some photographs, and this woman was not known to have had ever a partner for sexual intercourse. And when they described the findings, and when I saw the picture, they tried to say it was because she'd had no previous sexual intercourse. But in fact, it was scarring. And the kind of scarring you get when you've been sold for human trafficking as a child. She ended up needing an operation to correct those scars. Trauma-informed care obviously is not perfect. What are some of the possible errors? One of them is pressure. People, they're so interested in understanding how this person feels and how they got here that they start pushing people to tell their story before they're ready to. People's story, it comes out slowly, and it comes out sideways sometimes. And when we talk more about PTSD, we'll talk about some of those sideways descriptions. Projection, that's a hard one because people want to use empathy. If I went through that, then I would feel this. However, it's important, it's not a bad place to start. Use your feelings and your sensitivity, but it may not be the case. One gal, for example, she had a just terrible, terrible history in terms of sexual assaults. And her way to manage that is to get like the biggest damn dildo anybody ever saw in their life. And that for her feels like control. Okay. And she doesn't harm herself. This is just a stage of her recovery. Other people are saying, nah, wouldn't do that. But they didn't let their own personal reactions dictate what this gal did for her own personal recovery. Pity is obviously disgusting and doesn't belong anywhere in anything we do. And premature conclusions. I know this much of a person's trauma history, so I think that they're doing this because of this. Probably true, may not be true. The person who has this history of being beat up and punched might grab their abdomen as a partial flashback, body memory, or they might have appendicitis. So we gotta always check, right? We can't draw conclusions until we've really done a thorough job. A certain percentage of people will develop full syndrome post-traumatic stress disorder, 19-20%. It's not the majority, it's a lot, but it's actually no higher than any other population of people subjected to extreme trauma. Does everybody exposed to trauma without a chance to recover develop PTSD? Nope. Many, many, many other outcomes. Certain health problems are more common amongst people with unresolved trauma, and recovery from those health problems is harder in people with unresolved trauma. Not 100%. Some people were exposed to toxins, and that's why they have a much higher percentage of cancers and so on. But there's also some evidence that unresolved trauma interferes with recovery from cancer, depending on the cancer, depending on the person. And as we all know, there are certain cancers nobody can do anything about yet. And trauma recovery, may or may not be of help to that person. Very, very important to avoid anything that comes across as blaming of the individual for their illness. Well, if you just did more therapy, that's not reasonable. But it is important to know that if we can help a person recovery, the rest of their health is going to be a little bit better. What are other influences on how unresolved trauma or excessive toxic stress? Well, one of them is genetics. Family genetics. In some families, the people under stress always get coronary artery disease. Other families, everybody gets ulcerative colitis. In other families, everybody gets migraines or depression or what have you. Stress, the effect of chronic stress or unresolved trauma can be in some ways dictated by family genetics. Personal genetics can be an issue as well. For example, people with Fragile X with unresolved trauma or toxic stress have a much higher likelihood of coronary artery disease, autoimmune disorders, some of the more severe forms like the lupus and so on, and certain endocrine conditions. People with Williams syndrome may develop kidney failure much sooner under the influence of severe chronic stress. So people will say, well, kind of summarize. What is it that this does to people? It's like we talked about before, and I'm sure many of you have seen this cartoon before. It's like your brain is on a very, very advanced DEFCON level all the time. It only takes this much to start a fire. The person's ready for a fight, flight, or freeze pretty much all the time. So what happens after a person recovers? What does that look like? Well, people have pretty good health. Their health improves. It may not cure their cancer or rheumatoid arthritis, but they have a better shot at healing and recovery from those things. The chemo starts working more like it should. People can respond in situations according to the current situation, not like they're still fighting off attackers from years ago. Their use of intoxicants, what I call, the virtues of vice, return to tolerable, less unsafe levels. Instead of being on high doses of marijuana 24 hours a day, people return to more of a recreational kind of a occasional use. The quart of tequila a day comes down to the occasional sip from time to time. And if people are exposed to a small stress, they have a small reaction, not a gigantic one. It's a proportional response to stress. Is it true that people who've been abused go on to abuse other people? The answer is not necessarily. Most people who've been harmed never hurt anybody else. And many people who are the most horrific serial perpetrators have never had anything bad happen to them. So we need to, that's sort of a TV idea that this leads to this, and it really isn't held up. So don't let your thinking be diverted by that. So people will say, well, this person doesn't use speech, the records are absent, how are we going to figure out what happened to them? Well, a person's body often tells the story, or the way they move and posture tells the story. For example, the gal I told you about who the foster father was photographed in the act of assaulting her, we started looking because even the gentlest staff couldn't help her change her adult undergarment without her shrieking in terror. Well, what does this mean? Well, eventually we found out, and the record was there, it was in police reports, but nobody had done anything about it. But we worked with her, and now she's not afraid of being changed, of having her G-tube changed, or of being showered. She used to be, but she isn't anymore. What are some other clues? It used to be a common practice that if a child with an intellectual disability was sexually assaulted, the next thing that would happen to them is that they would be sterilized. And so the thinking on that was pretty convoluted, and I see no justification, yet that was what was done a lot. So if we see that history, somebody who had a hysterectomy when they were 10 and didn't have a medical reason, more than likely we're going to discover something dreadful happened at that time. Any unexplained scars on the person's body, I will say, do you remember how this happened? Can you tell me about this? Can you draw me a picture of it? Can you show me what happened? Person who gets lots of urinary tract infections and there's no reason. They don't have an anatomical issue or a hygiene issue or anything of that nature. Cervical inflammation on a pap smear in a person who's not known to have a volitional partner. It's very difficult to get that without sexual assault. Hepatitis B and C are venereal diseases unless proven otherwise. Now, in the old institution records, they used to try and say they got it from a bite, which was probably true a few times, but most of the time those infections would come about from sexual contact, and often it was contact that wasn't wanted. Abuse of siblings. People that harm their siblings often have been harmed. People that injure themselves in masturbation. I'm not talking about people that are interested in sort of ordinary, harmless BDSM community type activities, but people who genuinely mutilate themselves in association with sexual activity. That often has a severe trauma history underlying it. And people that go out of their way to try and get staff to beat them up. And okay, I think many of us have worked with people over the years that you almost want to step back and go, why? And you should step back and go, why? When people are trying to induce other people to punch them. And sometimes, there's this one guy, his name is George, and George walked right up to me. I'd never met him before. I was visiting an institution. I tell more about his story when we talk about trauma. The first thing he did was walk up to me, step on my feet, and put his hands around my neck and start to squeeze. And he was looking at me, looking in my eyes. Again, one of those situations where several things go through your mind. And I'm not saying I said the right thing, but I said, George, I'm not going to hurt you. And he smiled and let go and walked away. And on the one hand, I go, man, you could have just asked. But on the other hand, what an efficient way to find out what I'm about. 5 seconds or less, he knows if I'm going to try and respond to that with a fight. Where else do we get information? And this goes to the comprehensive assessment, which we're also going to talk about a little bit later. Other people that lived in the same place at the same time are fantastic informants, especially when you just say, tell me the story however it is, and don't cross-examine them, because the correct story will tumble out. The first part of it may sound, oh, that can't be right. I mean, did that really? But instead of cross-examining or arguing, just listen. That's how we found out about the kids being used as prostitutes in that one children's home. Is the person said something outrageous, we didn't question, and he said, well, that wasn't really true, but this is. Neighbors, staff that worked at the place that are willing to tell the secrets of the place. Teacher's notes, police reports, and old records that haven't been destroyed or sanitized. Treatment works. That's the summary statement of evidence-based studies. Treatment works. There's 6 points in the protocol. What we're going to talk about today in terms of trauma-informed supports is the 6th part of the protocol, which is elimination of iatrogenic factors and habilitative changes to facilitate growth and recovery. Well, what's iatrogenic mean? Iatrogenic means harm caused by what we do in terms of treatment or support. For example, it was noticed for many years that doctors would spread infections because they failed to wash their hands. That's an example of an iatrogenic issue. People that wouldn't have gotten sick get sick because of those unwashed hands. Well, what are some of the iatrogenic factors in everyday programming that we might want to dispose of? Well, top of my list is a very pervasive category in some places called stupid rules. Now, I bet every one of us has worked in a place where we observe stupid rules. Examples. You can only eat at the table when everybody else is eating, and you can only eat what we prepare for you. Does that make any sense for any adult or even most children? Goodness. Incompetent or rude healthcare providers, and encouraging people to go along and get along with rude, incompetent healthcare providers is actually quite dangerous. But instead, to find a way to somebody better is much more important, much more helpful. Forcing contact with perpetrators. The way I've seen this happen is I just saw a case like this. This is in another state where a child was tortured nearly to death by his birth mother, starved to the point where his bones were poking through his skin, and permanent scarring on his feet because she burned his feet with a hairdryer. And some judge thought that family reunification was the thing to do. And even though this kid was protesting in every way he could, sent him back to that family system. Forced contact with perpetrators. It damages people, and that kid nearly died. And that same judge is still trying to figure out a way to send him back because of this idea of family reunification. Humiliating, boring, coercive behavior support plans. We've all seen them. We all know what they are. Unwanted housemates, unnecessary extra medicines. That's why as we've worked together with people, I'm always trying to trim back, get rid of the stuff that we can get rid of. And irrelevant goals. The because we can goals, like bed making. Everybody, how many of y'all made your bed this morning? If you didn't make your bed, you probably shouldn't be allowed to come to work, right? Setting the table, folding napkins a certain way, folding their laundry a certain way. Other iatrogenic factors, and these are all things that will, they're not overtly traumatic, but they are a toxic stress. Unnecessary toxic stress. Anything that involves treating an adult like children, like a child, in a demeaning way, we should forever banish the words, now use a napkin. You can't go out until you make your bed. The only appropriate response to a fabulous fart or burp is good one. If you say anything, certainly we should not be saying, say excuse me, or reprimanding adults for profanity. That's ridiculous. I'd much rather people cuss me out than many of the other alternatives. It's 12 degrees below zero. This is Minnesota. The snow is falling. The participant and all the housemates, because unfortunately Minnesota still uses lots of group homes, which are, many problems in and of themselves. The participant and all the housemates are getting ready to go to the movies, right? And the person we are talking about says no when asked if he'd be willing to put on his coat. 12 below zero, snow is falling. Obviously not a Sacramento story. What are trauma-informed responses? You're holding everybody up. Get moving. No. Do you need me to put it on for you? Put it on now, or else you don't get popcorn at the movie. Or put aside the coat, grab a blanket, dash out to the van, get it all warmed up, pull it as close as you can to the front door, stay close to the guy who's refusing his coat while you drape him with the blanket, get everybody into the warmed up van, and after everyone is settled, say, I brought a blanket to throw on you if you get cold. And it sounds silly, doesn't it? But I bet you know what the answer is, right? The holding everybody up, that's shaming, that's arrogant. Who do you think you are talking to your employer like that? Do you need me to put it on for you? That's very infantilizing, isn't it? Threatening? No. And instead, they didn't fight with him at all. They just made it safe. We don't want you to freeze to death, and we don't want to be coercive. So we're going to work to keep you warm, but we're not going to fight with you about this coat. Well, had such a weird outcome. Later on, after the movies, we had a good time, blah, blah, blah. By the way, why didn't you want to? Well, smell it. My coat stinks. What does it smell like? Well, you smell it. Well, this was when marijuana was still not legal in Minnesota. I don't know if they made it legal yet, but you can't make this up. One of his staff was hiding in his closet, this employer's closet, to smoke a lot of weed while he was on shift, and he made the coat stink. So, not fighting with him, we ended up way over here with some really interesting information. There are physiologic states, not just in the brain, but in the whole body, that influence a person's ability to learn and function. What are physical states that interfere with recovery and growth? Physical hunger. This business of ordering people to only eat certain foods on a certain schedule, and the one that just makes me lose my mind is when other people decide this person needs to lose weight before that person wants to. Oh my goodness. What they do to people by forcing hunger on them is it's destructive. All they need to do is watch a few seasons of Alone to know what happens to people when they don't get enough food to eat. Intense anger, that interferes with recovery. So enraging people, picking fights with people, does not help them in any way. Intense fear, which is the type that's caused by a lot of coercion, scaring people. Stress, fatigue, body pain, and excessive fears. These are body states and feeling states that actually interfere with healing, recovery, growth, and learning. So, some other time and energy wasters, telling people to act like they like somebody they don't like. This is a ritual in some families, isn't it? Oh, you like Aunt so-and-so? No, she smells bad. Whatever, right? Complying with a schedule the person didn't make and doesn't want. Reprimanding profanity, yes, I do tend to perseverate on that point. And clothing and makeup standards imposed by somebody else. These sound trivial, but it's a ritual of coercion that interferes with people going forward in their lives and deciding for the person when they need to change their weight, quit smoking, eat more vegetables, stop eating gluten, what have you. Counseling people to be obedient with unacceptable living situation is a form of coercion that is, unfortunately, it's a ritual in some places. I don't see it so much in California, thankfully. But the idea of you have to succeed in the situation you hate before you're allowed to live someplace where you'd like. Telling people to be obedient with anybody who wants to give them orders. That's terrible, isn't it? Turn people into victims. So what's a trauma-informed response when somebody's punching people? Stop that. Yeah, that always works, doesn't it? Your behavior is upsetting other people. Oh, that always helps a lot too. So on and so forth. There's all kinds of ways to respond. What are some ways that you might respond? Think about it as you're listening to this presentation. I really want you to quit that is one of the ones I really dislike the most, because it assumes that your opinion should matter to that person. Come on. What's going on? Can I help? You look really upset. What's going on? Those are responses that are more likely to join with the person and produce a better outcome. It's really important to avoid using the person's energy budget on stuff that don't need to be fixed. We also probably need to do some stuff to repair previous interventions. There's one fellow, he's new in the enhanced unit, and the first 5 questions he asked me were how many minutes before he would be punished this way, or before he would be punished this way. And it's still taking him months later to realize, no, if you have a hard day, we just want to help you feel better. We're not going to punish you for having a hard day. Oh yeah, if you got to beat something up, do it. Much rather you bust up the furniture than hurt yourself. And he's still having a very hard time with the whole idea, but each time he believes a little more of it, he's happier. He sleeps better. He enjoys more things. He's playing on a baseball team with other people. Before he came to us, he was spending hours and hours every day in restraints or seclusion. Blaming is a really, really common past experience of people. And sometimes they'll blame themselves just to preempt the blaming they expect from others. People with IDD who survive to adulthood are stronger than the average person. Those who passively sit back and obey every order and do every single thing that somebody tells them to have a shorter lifespan. So to fight that energy that people use to stay alive is not a proper conflict to perpetrate, but instead to celebrate that power and help the person use it in successful ways can be the key to this person living their best possible life. It can take years for people to trust, years. And each time there's a new stress or a new success or a new opportunity, the person will back up and start testing again. People are constantly asking questions of the people around them, particularly those who offer support. Are you going to hurt me when you get angry or just because you like it? Because they've already encountered people like that. Are you loyal? Or are you going to make excuses for abusers? And this goes back to sometimes people who've been abused by specific people will say, well, you know, the individual themselves who was injured will say something like, well, they just did that because that was done to them. And part of us wants to go, oh, you know, I respect the way you formulate that, but in fact, that's the wrong answer. The loyal answer is, I don't care why they do it. They shouldn't have done it to you. Will you stick by me no matter how I look in public? one of our employers did the most fabulous thing ever. He detected that a supervisor in his care was a member of a church that has an absolute moratorium on people cross-dressing. And he found this out by accident about this particular supervising staff member. She would never in 1,000 years ever share that part of her personal life with her professional life. So one day she walks in to visit with this man, and he says, I want to wear dresses. I want to look pretty. I want to wear hair. Now, this is a brand new thing that somebody's discovering in their 30s. What do you think that was really about? Obviously. So what's the right answer? The very next day, this particular supervisor, who's a superstar in many ways, shows up to his house with a bag of dresses, wigs, makeup, jewelry, heels, and they played dress up for days. And then he never wanted it again since. What a brilliant test. And what a fun way to pass it, right? Are you on a power trip? Are you going to try and overpower me? Are you just waiting for a chance to show me who's boss? Do you mean it when you talk about choice making, sexuality, sexual expression, looking however I want to look? Do you lie or pretend and tell me you're more committed to me than you really are? A lot of people have experienced that, haven't they? Do you experience remorse when you make a mistake? Do we all make a mistake? Absolutely. We all, no matter how hard we try, we will make a mistake. The correct thing to do is to admit it and apologize, right? Yet, how many of us have worked in places where they said, just pretend it was fine. Just pretend like nothing happened. Feeling states, body states that are kind of neutral in terms of recovery, indifference, boredom, being flattened out. No reason for a person to have to spend a lot of their day like this. What are the feeling states that encourage that growth and recovery and healing and passion and joy in life? Well, those are excitement, positive excitement. It doesn't have to be about anything particularly stupendous. It could be every little thing. But to have enthusiasm and optimism about it is really good for people. Mild positive stress. The person themselves has to decide about what this is. Passion, affection. Remember that old trope about, don't be involved, don't be warm, don't be friendly. We already talked about why that's destructive. It's also not true. The more warmth and affection, as long as it's not transgressing boundaries or anything like that. But the more warmth and friendliness and affection like you would have for a sibling that you like, the better people do. They just do better when they're surrounded by that healthy, non-icky, non-intrusive kind of warmth and affection. Amusement. I know. You ready for the cliche? Cliche is true. Laughter is the best medicine. Okay, I couldn't help myself, but it is true. Multisensory involvement. If something sounds good, that's great. If something sounds good, smells good, and looks good, that's even better. That's why cooking your own wonderful food is often even better than just having it served to you, right? So other changes that are important in creating these trauma-informed support environments, elimination of cliques. Now, what's the difference between a clique and a very cohesive staff? Well, the big difference is how they treat new people on the team. Cliques tend to be exclusionary. They tend to set people up to fail. Really tight-knit, effective, successful staff welcome the new staff member and help them succeed. They don't hide stuff from them. They help them succeed and be part of this community of healing and recovery. Opportunities to process together when something traumatic has happened. We have a lot of different kinds of ceremonies of that type here at STEP. Juneteenth, the holiday party, celebrations of life when somebody's transitioned to the next phase, small, medium, and large gatherings of various types where people, raise a cup of coffee to somebody that they treasure and appreciate. Zero tolerance, we know about that. That's part of the training. And frequent celebrations of success. So one action for today to contemplate. Pull out a person's support plan, if they have one. Next to each item, just jot down whose idea it was. So-and-so will learn to thus and such. Well, that was the case manager's idea, or that was the sister's idea. Ask the person if they agree with that as being important to them. And then have a trial of getting rid of everything the person says is not important to them. And see how they do. They'll either say, no, I guess that was something I do want to work on, or they'll say, well, this is more important to me. I'd rather do this instead, now that I'm not wasting time on this. Or they may want to just do without expectations for a minute. And that's kind of okay, isn't it? There's this guy, and he gave me a gift. Each of these is an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. And this guy spends 2 or 3 hours a day with a pencil and 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper drawing these grids and checkerboards. 2 or 3 hours a day, every day, plain white paper and a number 2 pencil. Does this every single day. And over the years, people say, well, that's not a productive activity. What's he learning from that? That's a perseveration. That's all kinds of stuff. And each time they tried to get him to do something else, he would get very upset and get a lot more self-destructive. So people are like, just respect it. And part of the reason people had a hard time respecting it is that they could not understand it, because the guy who does this and hand draws these things for 2 or 3 hours every day, plain white sheet of paper with these number 2 pencils, is blind, completely blind. And he does this freehand. Nobody understands how he does it. And do we have to? Probably not. Probably not, but we do have to respect it. Idiosyncratic useful responses. Look through the person's history. Was there something that they did that people thought was so weird that they ought to just stop doing? And maybe they programmed it away from them? But maybe it's something to think about if it really was harmless. See if maybe that person might want to reintroduce it into their life. Because that's the richness of individual character and personality. So, what do employers owe DSPs? Nothing. The answer is nothing. We are not entitled to respect, obedience, compliance, any of that. We hope for an opportunity to help and help that person grow and succeed. So, we talked about this, we talked about this, we talked about this. The summary of trauma-informed care as compared to neutral or coercion-based supports, the results are much, much, much better for not only the individuals receiving services, but the individuals who offer services. Now, this picture is a photograph I took. I used to have this office in Denver. It was in one of those funky old Victorian houses in a kind of a semi-crappy neighborhood. And the stairs were these slabs of stone. There was no dirt in between them, but these were the front stairs, and we showed up and we got this going on. We didn't plant flowers between the steps, but this is what we got. So, okay, this is kind of a shrinky idea. Tell me what you think of it. Is we interpreted that to mean that if we create a situation where everything we do is oriented towards growth and nurturing, what we end up with is growth and beauty in places we never expected and where some people would have said it's impossible. Thanks for listening.